Good morning. So the title of my presentation is Zone of Peace, the environmental impacts of militarization in the Indian Ocean region. One of the most neglected aspects in discussions of climate change and global warming are the impacts of militarization and the related phenomenon of what has been termed ocean grabbing, usually by distant water fishing states. In this presentation, I would explore the intersection of geopolitical competition in the region, which is arguably the busiest energy, trade, communications, and undersea or submarine data cable route in the world, and the environmental impacts of ongoing militarization as a new Cold War emerges between the United States and China and their allies. Finally, I would be suggesting the need to decolonize the Indian Ocean region so that its resources may be sustainably harvested and used by small littoral countries and fisheries communities. As we know, the Indian Ocean has emerged as the heart of the global economy in the 21st century. The rise of Asia, led by China as the growth hub of the world, has resulted also in a trade war by the United States that has spilled into a hybrid maritime trade war and intense militarization of the IOR, which is part of China's Maritime Silk Route and the Belt and Road Initiative for connectivity and infrastructure development in the world. The IOR is also rich in resources, both living and non-living, including oil, gas, and minerals, which are important for the global economy at this time, particularly rare earth minerals and rare earth elements. The IOR is also the heart of undersea data cable routes, which are important for communication systems and the internet and the global financial system, since much of the data goes through these undersea data cables and not through satellites. Now, militarization and hybrid war are huge environmental threats, but tend to be invisible in climate change discussions and discourses. As these pictures show, the Malabar Naval Exercises, or Quad War Games, as they were called, happened in October 2020 and resulted in the beaching of 100 plus pilot whales, many of whom died, and dolphins off the coast of Sri Lanka. This was unprecedented, and it shows the extent of militarization and its impacts. The consolidation of Quad saw then the largest stranding of whales, pilot whales, in Sri Lanka. Now, what is the Quad? It is the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, and coming together in the oceans particularly, and their submarine and aircraft carriers sonar systems had disoriented the whales and the dolphins. Marine scientists have called for a ban on use of sonar systems, and I think the Canary Islands has actually banned their use. Environmental groups in Sri Lanka, as well as people and the Navy, came out to save the whales that had been endangered by the big states' war games. This whole scenario reflects the vast inequalities in the fact that small Indian Ocean countries are forced to bear the environmental costs of big powers' war games, and often these small countries have limited use and access to their own ocean resources. Now, Quad is the equivalent of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, set up for the Indian Ocean region, targeting China. Air pollution and garbage are also neglected topics in climate change discussions. In 2018, 260 plus garbage containers from Britain came to Sri Lanka, and many of them contained medical waste and human remains. As we know, many EU countries had been sending garbage for processing to Asian countries for decades. In 2018, China and many other Indian Ocean countries like Malaysia and Indonesia banned the import of and processing of garbage, which is probably how it ended up in Sri Lanka. After protests by environmental groups and court proceedings, just 21 containers were finally shipped back to England 2 years later. It is believed that the British garbage that came to Sri Lanka came actually from the British Indian Ocean Territory, or BIOT as the British call it, which the rest of the world calls the Chagos Islands, where the Diego Garcia military base is housed. Now, in 2019, February, the International Court of Justice at The Hague ruled that the UK occupation of the Chagos Islands was illegal under international law. Chagos Islands has been blacked out of Indian Ocean maps, and its history is remarkable. It was leased by the United Kingdom, which occupied Chagos and Mauritius, in the early 60s to the United States for the Diego Garcia military base. The Chagosian people were driven off their island home and scattered in Seychelles, Mauritius, and in England. And after court proceedings in the US, UK, they finally went to The Hague. So there's a question and a joke. How do you whitewash a CIA black site called Diego Garcia? You greenwash it. Military bases in the Indian Ocean are numerous: Guam, Djibouti, Singapore, and there are numerous others in the Middle East. The US Strategic Islands Policy and the colonization of Indian Ocean islands has been detailed in the books by David Vine, an anthropologist who also wrote the book on the Chagos Islands titled The Island of Shame, The Hidden History of a New US Base. Vine is also the author of Base Nation and the United States of War, which chronicles 800 military bases and lily pad bases, which are the marine bases. There's a war going on right now in Yemen, and there's a building of another base at this time. Now we turn to ocean grabbing, which is an old phenomenon similar to land grabbing, but ocean grabbing is a relatively recent term. What is ocean grabbing? Actions, policies, or initiatives that deprive small-scale fishers of resources and dispossess vulnerable populations, coastal lands, and undermine historical access to areas of the sea in remote islands of the world. This is, of course, a narrow definition of the world used by the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, which has done a lot of very good work on ocean grabbing. There are different kinds of ocean grabbing. Living resources, which is primarily fisheries resources and related fisheries products, as well as non-living resources, seabed resources, including oil, gas, minerals, rare earth elements, and minerals. Ocean grabbing by big states, colonial powers, and private entities in the name of security and for military bases has been ongoing ever since the Second World War ended in the Indian Ocean region, as well as by private mining corporations are also involved in ocean grabbing. So ocean grabbing of living resources is primarily concentrated on fisheries in the Indian Ocean region, and the tuna fisheries industry in the IOR is $1 billion industry. Indian Ocean littoral states tend to practice what is called artisanal fishing, which is very small scale and environmentally sustainable, while distant water fishing states tend to take many of the large high value tuna. France and Spain in Western Indian Ocean, and Japan and Korea, Taiwan and China in the Eastern Indian Ocean have been taking out the large high value resources. The distant water fishing states have huge quotas at the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission and engage in industrial scale fishing. And at the same time, we see the de-development of fisheries industry in small Indian Ocean countries. France has been overfishing in the Indian Ocean region, particularly the Western Indian Ocean, and Somali fishermen ended up in piracy after their fish were all overfished, as the Brookings Institution report has noted. Colonial powers have been fishing in the Indian Ocean for a very long time. Ocean grabbing also pertains to non-living resources, seabed resources, oil, gas, minerals, which are important for tech companies, particularly for the manufacture of chips, etc. Ocean grabbing is part of neocolonialism and the Cold War in the Indian Ocean at this time. There's a huge scramble for the Earth's remaining resources in oceans and space. The IO was never decolonized, unlike the land after the end of the World War II. And many countries in the global south became independent. Strategic islands in Indian Ocean remain colonial possessions from Chagos Islands to Guam. Today, colonialism in the Indian Ocean is being rebooted in the new hybrid maritime trade war. We need an archaeology of knowledge to understand the environmental crisis in the Indian Ocean region at this time and the colonial legacies and Cold War partitions of oceans in general. Whereas historically oceans were global commons for much of human history, increasingly oceans have been partitioned. Post-World War II period saw the non-aligned movement NAM declaring the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace in 1972 at the height of the Cold War, with global tensions between the US, NATO, and and the Russia or the USSR at the time. And the Indian Ocean was declared a zone of peace to be free from nuclear weapons and big power rivalry by the non-aligned movement. Under UNCLOS later, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, countries were invited to claim exclusive economic zones. So you have a further partitioning, if you will, of the oceans into exclusive economic zones around the countries, usually 200 meters from the coastline. So what's in a name? The Indo-Pacific has now become the center of a lot of discussion in world affairs. And the Indian Ocean has been, in a sense, renamed, or it signifies the partitioning, a new partitioning of the Indian Ocean. The IO has been partitioned into the Indo-Pacific on the eastern side and the Western Indian Ocean, with France dominating and claiming large parts of the Indian Ocean, using its colonial territories like Réunion because of its valuable minerals resources. Asia was formally conceptually partitioned during the Cold War into area studies regions from East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia, etc. And now we see the oceans also being partitioned in a new Cold War. India has joined Quad and its partners with the US in the new war. Hybrid maritime trade war and maritime disaster capitalism is an emerging pattern in the IOR at this time. There have been several shipping disasters, burning ships with deadly cargo targeting Mauritius and Sri Lanka within the last year, also off the coast of Iran. There was a Suez Canal blockage earlier this year, which fits a pattern of maritime trade trade disruption. The MV Pearl from Dubai to Singapore came to Sri Lanka and burned and sank and caused enormous, unprecedented environmental catastrophe for the country, which is still ongoing because there's a huge oil spill. And this happened just when the China Port City Agreement was being signed by the Sri Lankan government with the Chinese government. The MV Diamond was there 6 months before and caused an oil spill off the eastern coast of the island. And earlier on in the year, 1,000 tons of oil was spilled off the coast of Mauritius, which we know challenged the US and UK occupation of the Chagos Islands at the ICJ over the Diego Garcia military base. Also, the biggest Iranian naval ship was sunk at the same time as the MV Pearl environmental catastrophe in Sri Lanka. And salvaging and insurance is done by a Netherlands firm called Smith Salvos. These are all former occupying powers of the Indian Ocean region. So what we're seeing is both hypermilitarization and a new Cold War in the IOR, and small countries losing their maritime resources and access to them. With a great history and civilization, India at the center of the Indian Ocean region is the only country that has an ocean to her name. However, India has been busy fighting wars with her neighbors in the post-colonial period and has failed to lead the struggle to decolonize the IOR and enable its rich resources to be used by littoral states and communities. With the COVID-19 global reset, the G7 and NATO countries seem to be recolonizing the Indian Ocean, while small countries are again denied access to their resources. Small island communities are threatened, as is the case of the Chagos Islands, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka shows at this time. In conclusion, I would like to say that colonialism, militarization, and hybrid war are at the root of the current environmental crisis in the IOR. There's a need for Indian Ocean studies and the Indian Ocean World Center to focus more on the colonial legacies and Cold War history and move beyond the sort of methodological nationalism that characterizes Indian Ocean studies to understand the current environmental crisis in the IOR. The hidden Cold War history of the US, UK, France, and Dutch colonialism, which is ongoing, and neocolonialism, including militarization and the bases, need further study. We have seen too much of a romance with identity politics and European colonial history of the 18th and 19th centuries, also partly due to funding for these kinds of studies by governments. And finally, I would like to end by saying that the IOR needs to be demilitarized, and we need to return to that early declaration of the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace by the non-aligned countries and the non-aligned movement. Thank you.